Hello, Life Science. So we are done with bacteria, but we're going to stay microscopic because we are moving on to kingdom Protista. These are organisms called protists, and they include protozoa and algae. So we're going to start out by defining the term plankton. There's two kinds of plankton, but plankton basically means microscopic organism. So zooplankton are tiny floating organisms that are either small animals or protozoa. Phytoplankton refers to tiny floating photosynthetic organisms, primarily algae. So the idea is basically that up in the large scale world, the world that we inhabit, we divide things into categories like animal, vegetable, and mineral. So life science, forget about the mineral, we got animal and vegetable. What do we mean by that? Animals are things that hunt or graze or otherwise go out and get their food. They move, they consume. Those are animals. Vegetable doesn't just refer to plants because it can also refer to fungus. But if we're thinking mostly of plants, we're thinking of things that are rooted in the ground. And they don't move. They produce their own food by photosynthesis. And that kind of dynamic that animals and plants have up on our level, that also exists microscopically between zooplankton and phytoplankton. So you can always kind of think of zooplankton as like the microscopic version of animals and phytoplankton as the microscopic version of plants. They are not necessarily technically animals or plants, but they perform the same ecological roles. Also, it's worth noting that most photosynthesis on the Earth is done by phytoplankton. It's not trees, it's not grass, it's microscopic photosynthetic organisms in the ocean. All right, so subkingdom Protozoa, let's talk about some microscopic, kind of like animals, protozoans. So the first phylum of protozoa that we're going to talk about is called Sarcodina. And they move by what's called a pseudopod. Pseudo means fake or false, and pod means foot or leg. So it's fake leg basically means it's almost like a leg, but it's not quite. It is a temporary foot-like extension of a cell used for locomotion or engulfing food. So the cytoplasm has a thin, watery part called the ectoplasm and a dense part called the endoplasm. You can almost think of it like Jell-O that didn't quite get made right. So there's a firm part and then there's like a wetter part. So what happens is the cell deforms the cell membrane by forcing endoplasm near it. That's the dense part. The cell will push itself into the new space, and then the cell can also engulf food with pseudopods. It's really amazing locomotion, and you should take a look at it. Continuing on with Phylum Sarcodina, there is one species that most people mean when they say amoeba, and they're referring to Amoeba proteus, which reproduce after reaching their full size, which is after 3 days, and they form a protective cyst to survive harsh circumstances, kind of like bacteria form an endospore. There are other kinds of amoeba, for example, in the genus Entamoeba, there's a few species. Entamoeba gingivalis lives in the human mouth, which might sound gross until you consider that it's bacteria that cause cavities. In fact, the Entamoeba gingivalis are larger than bacteria and are predatory toward bacteria. So they fight the good fight against the bacteria until you brush your teeth and kill them all. Well, that got dark. Well, anyway, Entamoeba coli lives in the human gut. You might notice it has the same initials as E. coli, the bacteria, but it is a different species, so you'd want to not abbreviate this in order to avoid confusion. And then Entamoeba histolytica causes dysentery. This is why you're supposed to be careful about the water that you drink. Phylum Mastigophora, you see here a picture of a flagellum. We talked about a flagellum in the context of bacteria, and any creature that moves with a flagellum is called a flagellate. That would be a protozoan that propels itself with a flagellum. Euglena is an example of Phylum Mastigophora. They can also move with a worm-like contraction, so it's not just by flagellum. And they also have what's called a pellicle. It is a firm, flexible coating that's outside the plasma membrane. If it were a bacteria and it had a rigid shape, we might call it a cell wall, but since it's flexible, we're going to call it a pellicle. So here's a couple examples of Phylum Mastigophora. First of all, there is genus Euglena up at the top, like I mentioned on the last slide. They are photosynthetic and saprophytic. If you remember what those words mean, photosynthetic means that they produce their own food by converting sunlight energy into food, and saprophytic means that they consume dead organic matter. Lovely. They also have a light-sensitive eye spot. This is really incredible. So do you see this red dot here in the corner? That is not technically an eye, because eyes are organs, and organs are made out of different tissue, and tissue is made out of different cells. That can't technically be an eye, but it does what an eye does for this Euglena. It allows it to be sensitive to light on one side and respond to it. So that is an eye spot. You'll also note the flagellum is on the opposite side of the Euglena. So it's almost like got an eye on its face and flagellum on its tail. It's a lot of shape and design for a single-cell creature. Below that, we've got genus Volvox. Genus Volvox are also photosynthetic. I mean, you can tell that these creatures are photosynthetic just because they're both green. And they're also colonial. And you can tell that too just by looking at that. They are all clumped together in this picture. They have 2 flagella. So if you'll remember from the systematic classification of life videos that we were watching very briefly, there was a division between creatures that have 1 flagellum called a unicont and creatures that have 2 flagella called a bicont. You'll remember then that we are uniconts. That was explained why. And so the creature on top, this Euglena, this would be a unicont, and these Volvox, they're a bicont. All right, so moving on there. Another phylum, we've got Phylum Mastigophora. So Phylum Mastigophora, they would include the genus Trypanosoma. They cause African sleeping sickness, and they are spread by tsetse flies. We've also got genus Trichonympha. They have a symbiotic relationship with termites, digesting cellulose in their gut. You probably know about termites. They're kind of famous for eating wood, maybe like making wooden structures collapse if they get out of hand. They can't digest the wood that they eat. That's actually something that this Trichonympha living inside of them helps them do. Here's another phylum of protozoans, Phylum Sporozoa. They have no form of locomotion, but they do have more than 30,000 species, all parasitic. Hooray! They reproduce with a spore that's a reproductive cell with a hard protective coating, and the way that works is that the cell reproduces its nucleus, then it surrounds this new nucleus with some cytoplasm and a hard shell. It's basically making a new mini cell inside of itself. Then the original cell disintegrates, and you've got the spore left over, and that's how it reproduces. So here's some examples of Sporozoa. First, we got genus Plasmodium that can cause malaria. Just delightful. And we've also got Toxoplasma gondii, which causes a disease called toxoplasmosis. They reproduce in the intestines of mammals, for example, cats, and they can produce birth defects. So maybe you've heard this advice, maybe you haven't, but women who are pregnant are not supposed to change kitty litter. Have you ever heard of that? You might have heard that, maybe not. But it's true that women who are pregnant are they're advised not to change kitty litter because of the risk of causing birth defects in their children. Because toxoplasmosis is caused by this protozoan, and it may be reproducing in the intestines of their cat, which would of course come out in the kitty litter. So yeah, let's move right on from there. Here's another phylum. It's called Ciliophora. So they don't move with a flagellum. They move with a smaller version of something kind of similar called cilia. There's a diagram of it on the right. So a ciliate uses cilia for locomotion. And cilia are these hair-like projections that extend from the plasma membrane and are used for locomotion. This is not something that a cell would only have one of. They'd have to have many, many cilia for locomotion. So here's some examples of phylum Ciliophora. These would all be ciliates. First, here's genus Paramecium. They have a macronucleus that controls their metabolism. And if you look at a picture of one of these, you should see kind of like a largest dot inside of it. That would be the macronucleus. The micronucleus controls reproduction. So they've got their, you might say, their brain split up into two spots, a macronucleus and a micronucleus. They have an oral groove lined with cilia. So oral groove basically just means a little dip inside of their plasma membrane, which is basically considered their mouth because that's where they intake food into their cell, and it's lined with cilia. So the cilia sweep food into a gullet through an oral pore. Basically, all those cilia lining the oral groove just kind of sweep food into the paramecia through this oral pore, a little hole. It's called an oral pore because it's a hole that it uses for its mouth. Okay, so conjugation is where they attach themselves to each other at the openings of their oral pore and exchange DNA. So it's not too different from what bacteria do when they exchange DNA with each other, but they don't have the pili to do that with, so they exchange it through their oral pore. All right, so here's another example of ciliate. We've got Balantidium coli. It's a parasite of many species, including pigs, rats, and guinea pigs. And it causes dysentery in humans. So it wasn't just the Sarcodine in genus Entamoeba. We've also got this one causing dysentery. Again, you got to be careful what water you drink. Okay, well, that's going to do it for protozoans. In the next one, we're going to take care of algae. So this is basically the microscopic animal-ish things. Next up, microscopic plant-ish things. All right, that's all.